So welcome at AWARE Archives of Women Artists, Research and Exhibitions for this event with Juliet Jacques, writer and filmmaker, and with Amelia Groom, who is our researcher in residency, as part of a program that is dedicated to research on women and non-binary artists in photography and video. And your work, your research is particularly on Claude Cahun and on Marcel Moore's artworks, and particularly on the outdoor photos made on Jersey Island. And so you will tell us a little bit more about this during this event. And that also engages with Claude Cahun's anti-mémoire, Aveu non avenu, that has been translated very lately, and you, Amelia, you have written the introduction. So this is also an entry point for this event, and that also resonates with your writing, Juliet. So Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore have been living in this area, in the Montparnasse area, as Marie Vasiliev did, the artist who gave the name to this place, Villa Vasiliev, who moved here in 1912. And so this is, of course, a legacy that we reclaim at AWARE. AWARE is dedicated to giving visibility to women artists. This is our space. It is an office. It is also a space for events like this one, for residencies, school workshops. And our work is also reflected on the online platform, where Amelia's research will be shown as a research article that should appear in the coming month. So I just wanted to conclude and thank the sponsors of this residency, Neuflis OBC, and notably Caroline Stein, who will be here today. This is really important for us. And it is important to encourage research on understudied subjects and give this space and dissemination to subjects and artists that have been looked at very little. So with that, I will hand over directly to you to make further introduction of Juliet and of your own work.
Hello, I'm Amelia. I'm going to sit here. Nice to see you all. I've been a resident here since January, and I'd like to extend my gratitude to the AWARE team for hosting me and making tonight's event possible. And I'm delighted to be joined by Juliet Jacques, who writes about art and cinema and literature and gender and football and all the good things. Her books include Trans, a Memoir from 2015, Variations from 2021, which is a collection of short stories about trans and non-binary people in the UK from the Victorian period to the present. And most recently, The Woman in the Portrait collected short stories we have here. And this evening, she's going to share with us a text from way back in 2016 called Sertraline Surrealism after Claude Cahun. And after Juliet's reading, I'm going to share some work in progress from my own ongoing research on these artists, and then we'll move into discussion and open up to questions. So save your questions to the end, but also feel free to raise a hand at any time if we're speaking too quickly or too quietly or there's any issues going on. We are recording, so be aware of that if you want to ask a question. We're going to talk, I think, about 20 minutes each, we estimated. So be comfortable, come and go as you please. Toilets are downstairs near the entrance. I'll do a brief visual description. We're here in the AWARE archive against some yellow bookshelves filled with books. I'm in a black shirt and Juliet's in red and white and black. And Juliet, thank you so much for being here and making the trip from London. I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. No, it's great to be here. I'm always so happy to be in Paris. It's one of my favourite cities, and it has the considerable benefit of not being in England, somewhere I'm always happy to not be. So as Amelia said, I'm going to read a text called Sertraline Surrealism after Claude Cahun. And as the title implies, it's a creative response to Cahun's work and Cahun's, sort of historical presence. Cahun's work and Cahun's person, even more than a lot of other writers and artists, I think, are quite hard to separate, given Cahun's own considerable experiments with memoir and anti-memoir. So this piece was commissioned by an Italian writer based in London called Daniela Cascella for a project called Smarginature, which is sort of inspired by Elena Ferrante's work, and was sort of looking at the idea of like writing from the margins, and so being interested in the way Claude Cahun sort of existed on the fringes of modernism, surrealism, early kind of LGBT writing, early kind of photographic collage. I thought it was an interesting person to respond to. So I'm just going to read this text. It will last about 20 minutes, and then we'll hand back to Amelia. So, I read somewhere that the romantic poets ate rotten meat before they went to sleep so they'd have more intense dreams. I can't remember where. I'm always memorising facts and quotes, but never where I saw them. It might have been in that Hugh Sykes-Davis essay, Surrealism at This Time and Place, where he argues that surrealism, rather than being a bold new movement, or even a fusion of Dada, Freudian psychoanalysis and revolutionary Marxism, was actually a continuation of Shelley, Byron, Coleridge and company, rendering it traditional and domestic, but probably not. It doesn't matter. I have sertraline. Abnormal dreams are listed as an uncommon side effect. 0.1 to 1% of users experience them, but I'm in that minority. I tried everything to manage my depression. Radical politics, psychotherapy, gender reassignment, reading and writing, but nothing shifted it. Age 34, with my first book, a memoir which brought catharsis, but also plenty of worries about how to represent myself and the, quote, transgender community behind me, I felt I had no option besides SSRIs. The effect that it would have on me would be revealed within a few weeks. Things that once induced panic now seemed manageable. The futility of life now felt like something that I could address creatively rather than meet with despair. For years, I worried that my mental health issues and artistic impulses were intrinsically linked, a precept fueled by reading the Romantics with their fixation upon the neglected genius, as well as André Breton's Nadia, René Crevel and other surrealists with their celebration of convulsive beauty. But not Claude Cahun. I didn't hear your name, or that of any surrealist women who shaped their own worlds, until much later. My anxieties dissipated. I found it was easier to write with a clearer head. But as the drug kicked in, my frantic neural activity manifested itself in sleeping visions, which felt more real than anything in my waking life. I'm outside l'Hôpital de Pitié-Salpêtrière in the 13th arrondissement in Paris. After months of talking online, I'm meeting N for the first time. N translates the plaque on Jean-Martin Charcot's work on hypnosis and hysteria into a language I understand. I take a moment to think about those women and what might have driven them into such a condition before we go into the garden. On a bench sits a blonde woman. A tarot reader shows her cards. I want to see them, but as I get close, the images turn into silver holograms. I request a reading, but neither of them pay any attention to me, and N leads me inside the church. I look for Charcot, but he cannot be found. Hysterical women line the pews, laughing spasmodically as Elle and I walk up the aisle in matching outfits, white shirts with black ties and long, white lace skirts with petticoats. As we reach the altar and pose for some photographs, they kneel. The statues of saints tell them to demand a cure from Elle and me. The congregation stand and march towards us. Elle and I race through a park to a network of abandoned tunnels beneath the hospital. I read the graffiti, Front National slogans and anti-fascist stickers, before we come out by a derelict building, its windows smashed. We enter through a red door with Joyeux Noël daubed across it in white paint and step into the corridor. We see Michelangelo's creation of Adam, but God has breasts and a penis. She/he touches a naked woman. Adam? With her fingertip. They're surrounded by faces that look familiar, but I don't recognise. Maybe they are Artaud, Breton, Perret, Soupeau, et al. It's dated the 3rd of October 1999, the day I turned 18, but it looks like the building was disused long before the end of the 20th century. Didn't Claude Cahun write that the year 2000 would be the end of the world? I remember about the Millennium Bug, which passed without incident, and the apocalyptic events in New York 21 months later, and all that came after. Next, we see 2 dining rooms. The one on the left is painted white, the walls bare, its windows barred. This must have been for the patients. The right-hand room is mustard yellow, with Klimt and Courbet on display, the window looking at the park and hospital in the distance. Both rooms are set for Christmas dinner, with fine china and cutlery on pristine tablecloths, crackers and tinsel, but there's nobody in sight. Unnerved, we return to the corridor. The mural has vanished. Only the date remains, 18th of July 2012, the day of my sex reassignment surgery. A stern man with white hair and thick eyebrows grabs me. "You do not fit," he says. "Neuter is the only gender that always suits me," I reply, before N asks, "I thought you preferred she and her." He lunges at N. I reach for N's hand and watch as my companion vanishes into thin air. "Your voice is male," he insists. "How do you know?" I reply. He strips me and then forces a needle into my left breast. As a group of men, medics or psychiatrists, run through the door and drag me out, I wake up screaming. Me. That dream, it's not real. N. Of course it's not. The symbolism is too convenient. Me. No, I mean it actually happened. N. Nonsense. Me. You took me to the Salpêtrière and told me about Charcot. It was a dreamlike experience, sure, but we did go to the hospital and the church, and through those tunnels to that abandoned building. N. Maybe so, but I'm a composite of several of your friends. You've changed lots of the details, and none of those other people were there. Me. Perhaps I dreamt them. N. No, you wrote them. Me. What is writing, if not lucid dreaming? N. But when you write, you're in complete control. Me. It's true that I create characters and put them in situations, often drawing on real life. After that, I never know what will happen. If I did, I'd have no interest in writing it. Sometimes I do things I don't expect, or even that I find abhorrent. It's not the same as a normal dream where you're a spectator in a scenario that your subconscious throws at you, but I admit. Years ago, I had a period of lucid dreaming. They never lasted long, maybe just a few seconds. But at some point, I'd know I was in a dream and could make decisions. If it was a nightmare, I could wake myself up. N. Did you keep a diary of them? Me. Only occasionally. I felt that writing them down would change them. I might misremember or embellish them, or even influence them in advance. N. Did you enjoy them? Me. Yes. My job at the time was unbearably dull, so it was the best form of escapism. I was always bored easily, even as a child, especially as a child, trying to make mundane suburbia more captivating. Anything that created its own world interested me. Video games, music, movies, novels. All that I consumed formed sediment in my mind, and it became impossible to tell what settled and what evaporated. I knew that Dada and Surrealism, Futurism, transgender theory and lived experience were important to me, while Romanticism, Rationalism and religion were not. But none of them transformed my waking hours into anything transcendent, or raised my dreams above reflections of my anxiety and frustration. Gradually, I realised that being a neglected artist or convulsive beauty was not what I'd been sold. The numerous rejections may not have been because I was ahead of my time, but because I wasn't good enough. Being desirable to men attracted to transgender women usually resulted in objectification or molestation. Before I turned 30, it had worn me down so much that I asked my GP for antidepressants and left with a prescription of 20 milligrams of citalopram a day. The suicidal thoughts lifted, as did the initial headaches and nausea. I lost my appetite and often felt exhausted, and was terrified of sleeping as I had such awful nightmares. On waking, I reoriented myself, but when sleeping, lines between dream and reality became indistinguishable. This, however, was not what I'd intended. I came off the medication, my appetite returned, I had more energy, and my dreams calmed down. I decided to try again to manage my depression through my material world, but again the cycle turned me back towards the pharmaceutical. This time, maybe, the side effects have been manageable, or perhaps, 5 years later, I'm willing to accept more of them if there's an overall improvement. Staying sane is a lifetime's work. I knew your name, Claude, but I hadn't read Disavowals or Cancelled Confessions when I was documenting my gender reassignment, first for a newspaper, then as a memoir. If I had, maybe I would have seen parallels between your declaration that neuter is the only gender that always suits me, and my conclusion that there are as many gender identities as there are people, all unique, all constantly being explored in conscious and unconscious ways. My articles were fragments, although they had to be realist, transparent like a window pane, written against myself and the literature I loved. Appropriately, it seems, your work came to me in pieces, an oblique self-portrait in a queer arts and culture volume here, a taster of Sarah Pucel's film Magic Mirror, which turned passages and images from Disavowals into tableau there. I finally encountered your work in its fractured whole when a friend from Jersey, who identified with your subversion of the island's Nazi occupation, curated an exhibition of your photographs with Magic Mirror and asked me to speak about your writing. It was hard to gather my thoughts on something so disparate. I admired that you could write for yourself and not bend your style into something sellable, even if your family literary background gave you all the intellectual and financial support that one could ever need. But what of that book that you assembled over nearly a decade and finally published in May 1930 in an edition of 500 copies that wasn't translated into English until 2007, well after the point in my life when I most needed it? I found 10 sections fronted by photo collages that reminded me of Hannah Hock, a mixture of self-portraits, familiar-looking faces, maybe Breton and his friends, disconnected bits of women's bodies, and my favourite, the chessboard under an ominous shadow that reminded me of Dada, Duchamp, C'est la vie. Most of them were titled with acronyms, private jokes decipherable only to you, but one stood out. Myself, brackets, for want of anything better. Then instantly, you turn towards and away from yourself, cloaking yourself in metaphorical prose poetry, opting out of that autobiographical pact by giving false impressions, before asking, express oneself, humiliate oneself? Yes, but for the right reason. But what are the right reasons? Is it the narcissism, the non-cooperation with God, and passive resistance that you wrote about so nakedly, Lacanium before Lacan? The need to record one's existence or subjectivity before leaving the stage? Was it a realisation that the personal is political avant la lettre, and that documenting your games with gender and identity might inspire others to make themselves into works of art? Or was it just that there was so much pain in being Jewish, assigned female, and queer in an anti-Semitic, misogynistic and homophobic world that you had to get these words out and throw them at someone, even if, as you knew, it wouldn't be many people, at least not in your lifetime? Trample on this, the flesh of my flesh, draw on remorse, weigh on my memory, on my obese statue, the only springboard that doesn't give way under me. This sentence, I understood why you'd cancel your confessions, the nightmare of being in a position where readers, critics, editors demand that you give more away to keep them coming back, the hope that external validation might fix your sense of self, stop it proceeding even further. They will define you, and then you won't know who or where you are. Nonetheless, I don't regret putting my life on a page, and I don't get the sense that you did either. Even if you weren't quite part of the surrealist group that so intrigued me, and given how hostile they were to anything besides heterosexuality, and how women were rarely more than obscure objects of desire for them, I can understand why. Your writings and self-portrait felt so phantasmagorical and so resonant that I hope we might meet in the very eye of night. I'm back at school in Surrey. I have this dream all the time, and it's always unbearable. I don't want to be here, and I don't need to do my GCSEs again. Nonetheless, I walk through the gate, past the bike shed and the basketball court, plus the playground where I spent every lunchtime kicking a tennis ball around in my itchy trousers. I stare up at the 5-storey tower block and then wonder why I keep coming here when I could just bunk the train to Brighton, and I enter by the English rooms and go to the library. There is a sign, Artist Salon. Anyone seen there will get their heads kicked in, I think, and then decide that I'm sick of having my life choices dictated by a small gang of bullies, and nervously enter. Behind the door, there's a beach. It's night time. I look up at the stars, and then at 2 men climbing into sailboats. The boat on the left has no name. The one on the right, smaller, has an inscription reading Ocean Wave. They set off. I wade into the water to try and stop them, but a voice stops me, telling me to let them complete their own legends. I turn. A person is sat alone, a checkered shirt and a shaved head. As I sit and watch the men drift over the horizon, oblivious to each other, the sea turns into a mirror, and we stare at our own reflections, neither of us recognisably male nor female. Claude. Hi, I'm Claude. I'm your careers officer. Nice to meet you. What do you want to do after you leave school? Me. Become a woman. Claude. No, I mean for work. Me. I don't know. Well, I want to be a writer. Everyone keeps telling me to forget it. Claude. I write. I just don't obsess about becoming famous for it. Me. Lucky you. Claude. You said you wanted to become a woman. Write about that. Me. I'm not sure. Claude pulls out some tarot cards. I imagine that these will confirm whether or not I reach my goal, but once again, I can't see what's printed on them. Claude grins at me and returns them to a shirt pocket. I look at Claude, frustrated. Claude. It would be boring to write about something if you already knew what was going to happen. I shrug. The destination never matters. It's the journey. Write about the clothes you wear, the labels you give yourself, and the sex you have with people of many genders or no gender, your mutilated victories and your brave defeats, the dreams you have and the body you inhabit in them. Write because you want to and because you have to, not because of what you think it might bring to you. And only show it to people if you think it will liberate them, or you. I nod and leave the room. I step outside, and the school has turned into the hospital where I worked as a cleaner when I was 16. The wards are named after towns and villages in Surrey: Ashted, Earlswood, Hawley. I walk along the sterile corridors, listening to the sounds of women screaming from the single rooms. Doctors pull the curtains as I pass. I go back inside. Instead of the playground and basketball courts, are lakes, and the tower block has been replaced by a grandiose Victorian building, red brick with large windows and pillars, with a perfectly ordered garden leading up to it. I walk along the path to enter and see Claude sat in the waiting room. As I reach the reception, a surgeon takes me into a laboratory and injects me with anaesthetic. At the moment I fall asleep, I wake up. That wasn't a real dream either, nor of course was it reality. The symbolism is too convenient, too obviously an encounter that I would have liked to have had when I had no possibility models, Laverne Cox's phrase, which I prefer to role models, in life or literature. If it was a dream, I doubt the dialogue would have been that clear or that memorable. Normally, I can only recollect fragments of conversations held in my dreams, and those who have shared a room or a bed with me in this state tell me that I either mumble something incomprehensible or utter just a couple of distinct words, usually ones that embarrass me. My sertraline dreams far outstrip normality, as I'm a spectator to long conversations that play out with friends and acquaintances, heroes and villains, the living and the dead. These must happen during my deepest sleep. A friend says that lucid dreams are a stage between that and waking, but these visions elude my control. I sometimes wonder what Charcot would have made of them. I hope that Cahun would have told me to embrace them and draw upon them by day and night. Even when they're nightmarish, I could tell Claude I want to turn them into poetry and prose as a weapon against reality, or what I am constantly told to accept as reality, usually by those who have the most invested in upholding the world as it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet. I'm going to jump straight in. Unlike Juliet's text, which is almost a decade old and gorgeous and finished and published, mine is very much work in progress. So there are some holes, but it will be published, or a version of it will be published on the website. So I'm going to look at this one image from Claude Cahun and Marcel's body of work. Look at and around it. I'm going to bring some other things into company with it. It's from circa 1948, from a series called Le Chemin des Chats, The Way of Cats. So this is Jersey Island after the war. I love Juliet's text, and I was so struck by this two presences of the tarot, the illegible tarot cards, because I wanted to start with maybe my favorite tarot card, the first card in the deck, the 0 before the 1, the Fool. And this is the first association I have for Cahun and Moore's The Way of Cats. Like the tarot's figure of the Fool, Cahun appears in bright sunlight, walking near the edge of a precipice with a small animal companion at their feet. The Fool card is associated with beginnings, initiation without hesitation, and the capacity to do without needing to know. There's a sense of trust and promise, and also disregard for possible danger. The Fool isn't looking where they're going, and the little dog might be warning them that they're about to walk off the edge of a cliff. Similarly, Cahun is blindfolded and guided by their cat, Nike, who is walking ahead on a leash. Here we go. So when Cahun and Moore relocated from Paris to Jersey Island in the late 1930s, they brought their beloved cat, Kid, with them, avoiding mandatory quarantine for animals by giving him a light sedative and sneaking him through in an Hermes handbag. They had a big house with a garden by the seaside, and they recalled that in those early years, Kid would often follow them down to the beach, Then, in 1940, shortly after France fell under German occupation, the Channel Islands were also invaded, becoming the only British territory to be occupied during the war. The beaches, including the one outside Cahun and Moore's property, became militarized zones. This is a photograph from 1940, showing Kid at the window with a group of German soldiers visible outside on the beach in front of the property. It's an ominous scene, and Kid seems to know it. Cahun's initial response when the German troops arrived on the island was to try to shoot the commandant. They took a gun to the forest for target practice, but they weren't a good shot, and Moore convinced them that they would miss. The couple then set out to attack the occupying forces through more indirect means, through what Cahun had theorized in the 1930s as indirect action. To try to sow discontent within the troops, they created a fictitious German newspaper and produced flyers with surrealistic insurrectionary messages. They secretly disseminated these papers around the island, slipping them into magazines and coat pockets or into homes that were soon to be inhabited by Germans. Moore, conveniently, had learned German as a child, so they were able to write everything in German and try to create the impression that there were anti-militarist and anti-Nazi sentiments coming from within the Germans' own ranks. After almost 4 years, Cahun and Moore eventually came under suspicion. They were arrested in 1944, and much of their work and archives were destroyed as their home was ransacked. They were supposed to be sent to Germany to be executed, but they ended up spending the long winter in prison cells, sick and malnourished, often in solitary confinement with no heating or water, sometimes not knowing if the other was alive or dead. They tried to commit suicide with the barbiturates they kept in case they were ever caught, but the overdose had only left them severely sick. Their illnesses were one of the reasons why their extraditions were delayed, and in the end, they were kept alive until the Channel Islands were liberated at the end of the war in May 1945. Looking back, Cahun said they had no regrets, but the most awful thing was that their cat Kid was killed when they were taken to prison. He had been a constant source of solace and guidance during the occupation. In their post-war writings, Cahun recalled that Kid had exemplified refusal of all concern. He offered a model of surviving with polite disregard, even when circumstances were dire. Cahun also notes approvingly that Kid was hostile to the occupying soldiers. At the same time, he maintained a healthy curiosity about the building work that was going on next to the house. This construction work was part of the fortification of the Channel Islands, a personal obsession of Hitler's, overseen by the Nazi engineering program organization Todt. They transported over 16,000 men to the Channel Islands, most of them prisoners of war, and workers captured and deported from occupied countries, many of them teenage boys. They worked under conditions of horrific abuse, deprivation, and malnourishment in slave labor camps to build an intricate system of towers, bunkers, tunnels, and concrete walls along the coastlines, including along the edge of Cahun and Moore's seafront property. Cahun recalled that they learned to adopt a similar attitude to Kid, with his healthy curiosity. They would clandestinely photograph the construction site and watch for an opportunity to speak with the workers or sneak food and supplies to them when they could, even though doing so was strictly forbidden. So they learned from Kid's very feline combination of aloof detachment and selective curiosity. When it came to their anti-fascist activism, Cahun also came to identify with the stealthiness of cats, who are known for being skilled at moving around undetected, with their highly flexible skeletons allowing for excellent balance, coordination, and agility. They also have padded paws with retractable claws, helping them to walk around without making a sound. Dogs, in contrast, do not have retractable claws, so they'll usually make clicking sounds when they walk on hard floors. An ability to move with stealth was key in the highly risky resistance work that Cahun and Moore carried out from 1940 until 1944. Looking back on this time, Cahun described creeping around the occupied island at night, taking shortcuts through the landscape that the Germans were not familiar with, to sneak into the camps and distribute collages and anti-fascist bulletins they'd made by proceeding in the manner of cats. In a longer version of this text, I would look at how Cahun and Moore were not alone in turning to cats as models and guides in anti-fascist work. As Lee-Claire Labarge has helpfully chronicled in her recent book, Marks for Cats, there is a long history of feline figurations within radical politics and emancipatory imaginaries, from the Black Panthers to Wildcat Strikes and Sabo Tabi and beyond. For now, I'll just point to Cahun's characterization of their wartime resistance work as necessarily proceeding in the manner of cats, which seems to me an important detail to have in mind while coming back to this image from their post-war series, The Way of Cats. I had been wondering about the presence of the blindfold in Cahun and Moore's The Way of Cats in relation to kink aesthetics, when I happened upon this 19th century painting by the Belgian artist and pornographer Félicien Rops. It's called Pornocrates, and it shows a sex worker being led blindfolded by a pig. She's naked except for her plumed hat, sheer stockings, long black gloves, and kinky sash of blue fabric tied beneath her bust. As with Cahun and Moore's image, there is some dynamic ambiguity about who is in charge. The four-legged animal is on a leash, but the person holding the leash is blindfolded and following in their footsteps. Rops was closely associated with the symbolist movement in France, and Cahun's uncle was the prominent symbolist poet Marcel, who contributed to an 1896 volume titled Féminines, which featured a series of illustrations by Rops. Cahun was very influenced by symbolism and by their uncle, and a number of early writings appeared in magazines published by him. Pornocrates was Rops's best-known work, so it's safe to assume that Cahun was familiar with this image from a young age. The word pornocracy comes from the Greek porne for prostitute and kratia for government or rule. 3 years before Rops's painting, the so-called father of anarchism, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, whose grave Juliet and I visited this afternoon in the Montparnasse Cemetery, had published his paranoid, anti-feminist and anti-queer diatribe, Pornocracy, or Women in Modern Times, in which he attacked the prospect of a feminist political future as a form of pornocratic decadence. Pornocracy is supposed to be bad and scary, tapping into patriarchal anxieties about the dominating influence of harlots. But it's clearly ripe for reclaiming within sex-positive and slut-positive utopian longings. Onto the next little pairing in my constellation here. This is a childhood drawing by the US feminist performance artist Carolee Schneemann, who later made many works with her cat companions as subject matter, as addressees, as collaborators, and as objects of devotion. She was a 7-year-old kid in suburban Pennsylvania when she drew this, 2 years before Cahun and Moore started their series, The Way of Cats, which was first exhibited posthumously in the 1990s. So the resemblances in this case are coincidental and not marks of any conscious referencing or inspiration. But Schneemann took coincidence very seriously as a research methodology, and Cahun was always interested in mirroring echoes, doubles, and repetitions. So let's consider the surprising correspondences between this circa 1946 drawing and circa 1948 photograph, both showing a cat on a leash taking a human for a walk. The drawn cat and the photographed cat are both positioned at the bottom of the image, front and center, in the foreground, with the human figure positioned behind them. In the child's drawing, the human has been cropped at the torso, so there's no room in the picture for the individuation of the face. In the middle-aged couple's photograph, the human who follows behind the cat is blindfolded, signaling a high level of trust and consensual surrender. These are both pictures of people who have agreed to be guided and accompanied instead of agreeing to occupy positions of separation and mastery over their animal companions. I'm blessed with muse cats who have inspired and guided my work, Schneemann once wrote. And I'm going to read this long quote from her because it's so nice. She says, the lessons from these cats include improvisation in space with found materials, risk and self-confidence linked in physical action, unrestrained tenderness and demonstrative love and affection. They have instructed as to the transitions between visible and invisible. They have clarified the motion between domestic worlds and a scale of landscape inaccessible to humans. They have heightened my concentration, patience, taught me the ability to sit in total silence and react instantaneously. They have enlarged and shifted my scale of perceptions, combining charming wit with psychological welfare, and absorb anxiety and turn it into purring contentment. They have clarified the presence and power of the paranormal and have expressed inspired, joyful devotion. End quote. This is from a diary entry. So historically, when cats have been feminized through a misogynistic lens, as they so often have, fears around loss of control have often come into play. One example can be found in this quote that I'll read from the Batman comic book co-creator Bob Kane, who is commenting on his ideas for the introduction of Catwoman as Batman's elusive and untamable love interest / nemesis. Quote, I felt that women were feline creatures and men were more like dogs. While dogs are faithful and friendly, cats are cool, detached, and unreliable. I felt much warmer with dogs around me. Cats are hard to understand. They are erratic, as women are. Men feel sure of themselves with a male, more sure of themselves with a male friend than a woman. You always need to keep a woman at arm's length. We don't want anyone taking over our souls, and women have a habit of doing that. Far from being fueled by fear and resentment about the prospect of having one's soul taken over, in Schneemann and in Cahun and Moore's work with cats, there is pleasure and enjoyment to be found in surrendering total containment and control. These are images from Infinity Kisses, a series of works drawing from Schneemann's collection of many hundreds of photographs she took to document the kisses that her cats delivered to her every morning upon waking over many years. Throughout the images, the artist's eyes are almost always closed, indicating trust and relinquishment, as well as sensual enjoyment. Because even for those not exploring forms of intimacy through blindfolds and dark rooms, it's very common to voluntarily shut down the visual sense when pursuing sensual pleasure. Maybe it's closing your eyes to smell a flower, to enjoy a piece of chocolate, to make out, or maybe it's turning out the light to rest, to dream, to touch in the dark. An emphasis on the erotics of darkness, shadows, veils, and mist, on partial, unstable, blurred, hallucinatory, and occluded vision, can be traced throughout Cahun's writing from the very beginning. To give just one example, there is a short symbolist text from 1918 called Cigarettes, published under the pseudonym Daniel Douglas, after Oscar Wilde's very bad gay boyfriend, Lord Arthur Douglas, where Cahun writes, quote, today, to fully savor the scent of your kisses, let your silk handkerchief be a blindfold over my eyes, end quote. In later works, Cahun would continue to interrogate the unsexy cultural primacy of vision, with passages and artworks that invite us to read possible critiques of what is now often called oculocentrism, referring to the West's privileging of vision over the other senses, especially when vision is embraced as the sense closest to the Enlightenment ideal of detached reason. This is a rare three-dimensional work by Cahun, which was exhibited at the Surrealist Exhibition of Objects at Charles Raton Gallery in Paris in 1936. In the middle of this little assemblage of found and made scraps, Cahun has concocted a single bloodshot eye. It's wide open and staring straight ahead, but it's detached from the rest of the body, from the brain, from the face, from the subject. The eye is painted on a tennis ball and elevated on a tiny stand as a disembodied organ of vision surrounded by a floating cloud. It's erected upright with phallic verticality, but the eye is also turned on its side, appearing adamantly vulvic. Cahun even surrounds the eye with pubic hair to emphasize its genital status. And then there's the addition of a hand in front of the eye. I read this organ of fingery touch as a reminder to not let optics become disconnected from haptics. The eye might want to float in the sky among the clouds and look down on the world with a disembodied view from above, but Cahun adds pubic hair and a hand to remind the eye of the erotics of down and dirty tacticality. In a 1936 issue of Cahiers d'Art Journal, a special issue on the object, which coincided with the Surrealist exhibition of objects, Cahun wrote an essay called Beware Domestic Objects, which is an excellent title. The text is geared towards getting in touch with objects and their non-utilitarian, irrational, latent, strange, unknown, and potentially liberatory powers. To do so, we can't just stand back and look from a detached distance, like an eyeball floating in the sky. In Cahun's words, we must discover, handle, tame, and construct irrational objects ourselves in order to appreciate the particular or general value of those we have before our eyes. So now we're at a hole in my work in progress, and I'm skipping over an unfinished section, which looks more at this work in relation to Cahun's political writings in the 1930s and their engagement with revolutionary politics and their increasing frustration with what they saw as the French Communist Party's excessive rationalism, which sort of like instrumentalized objects too much and didn't tap into their strange and latent and unknown powers. And the inscription at the bottom of the assemblage here is part of a critique that Cahun made in another text related to this. So you can read all about that in the version of this text that will end up on the website. I'll skip ahead to, Okay, so throughout this essay, Beware Domestic Objects, Cahun is attuned to the limits of using writing and explanatory language to advocate for the potentially liberatory forces and animacies of objects, insisting, quote, "I could go on and on about those objects, but they will speak to you better themselves, and they would speak still better if we could touch them in the dark." And this brings us back to The Way of Cats. The erotics of the blindfold, the bare feet emphasizing enhanced haptics, and the cat leading the way. Because cats often played a part in Cahun's twisted and indirect critiques of atomized individualism, and related to this, their critiques of detached oculocentrism. Especially in the book Cancelled Confessions, which was published in 1930. Written as an anti-memoir or a confessional autobiography that continually disavows the demands of the confessional form, this book frequently returns to the site of the self, but it's never the self as a closed unit that can be separated out from its ecologies of desire and dependency. When Cahun writes in the final chapter about trying to see their body from an external perspective, they immediately qualify that they mean my body with its dependencies. Seeking divestment from the authoritative sovereignty of autonomous selfhood, Cahun finds enjoyment in a mode of selfhood that is overtly dependent and accompanied and permeable, a selfhood that is environmentally distributed and contaminated, a selfhood that can be reinvented and undone and extended by proxies and prosthetics and needs and wants and multi-species companions and guides. When cats come onto the scene in cancelled confessions, they tend to bring some promise of leading us away from the construct of neatly contained human individualism and guiding us instead towards intensities of relationality. If we were two dogs, two unsociable cats, Cahun writes in the first chapter, we'd at least have possessed each other before sacrificing ourselves to the routine of our ferocious assertions of individuality. End quote. Later in the book, we encounter a feline mode of expansive curiosity as a way out of the unsustainable deadlocks of self-contained selfhood when a cat meets a mirror image. A cat is more curious than you, Cahun writes. It puts out its paw, encounters the strange, flawless piece of glass, checks the conformity of images, and goes to sniff the back of the mirror. End quote. The conformity of images in the flawless glass doesn't sustain the cat's interest for long. With a curiosity that is fully embodied and multi-sensory, they depart from the surface reflection in order to engage instead with its surrounding conditions. The cat is not going to be drawn in by the purely optical lure of the narcissus trap. They want to know what the surface of the glass feels like under their paw, and then they want to wander around the back and discover what the mirror smells like from behind. Cancelled Confessions was written 2 decades before the Chemin des Chats, but passages like this one might guide us towards a reading of the blindfold in the image as a suggestion that going the way of cats means adopting a haptic, olfactory, more than ocular embodiment of awareness, curiosity, enjoyment, and anti-fascist togetherness.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So Juliet, is it true that this text you wrote comes slightly out of this coincidence that you and Claude both went to school in Surrey?
Partly, yeah. I mean, that was something I found out researching the text. But yeah, Claude Cahun was, I think, something, if not an Anglophile, but I don't think it's a coincidence that they settled in, this place that is this sort of strange hinterland between the United Kingdom and France. And yet was educated in Ashted, a sort of independent girls' school in Surrey. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Surrey. It sort of forms this kind of reactionary wall around London. It's one of the most steadfastly conservative parts of the country. It's elected just a tiny handful of non-conservative members of parliament in its long and miserable history. Although my hometown did actually elect a Liberal Democrat last summer, which is testament to the collapse of the Conservative and Unionist Party of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But it was another of these sort of points of identification that I found, along with the more obvious ones around sort of gender and sexuality and interest in the surreal and informal experimentation and interest in kind of subverting the memoir form.
I'm sorry you were stuck there as a kid.
I got out as soon as I could. It had good train links and it's right next to a big international airport, my hometown, so it was raised to leave it not just for another city but for another country, which is one thing in its favour.
And so this scene that you imagine is this kind of time travel situation where you're both in this school, but you're a student and Cahun is the careers advisor.
Yeah, I mean, sort of playing with dreams and the possibility of dreams and the sort of creative possibilities, but also impossibilities of writing a dream and writing a dream in a narrative work, which is, often, too convenient and too perfect, as indeed the characters earlier in the text kind of explicitly talk about. But yeah, so it's a kind of fantasy, really, what would it have been like if I'd had someone like Claude Cahun around when I was growing up? Probably better than what I did have.
I guess I wanted to ask you about your ideas around memoir and confessional forms at this point in time. I guess Cahun is kind of advising you not to get into journalism, and I think you're kind of like, well, lucky you that you don't have to write for money, basically. I remember, like, in your memoir, Trans, there is a lot about, like, having to work shitty jobs and the mundanity of that, and Cahun didn't have to do that. So there's, like, a difference there, I think, in the relationship to what's expected of a writer and what you can refuse. But so you started out, basically, the memoir was your first book, I believe, or?
Second
book.
First one that anyone read.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so, I've always had this sort of tension between an interest in, fairly sort of obscure and marginal and often undeservedly forgotten historical figures who were doing something interesting with literary form, and particularly with first-person narration and types of autobiographical writing. So my first book was on an English author called Rainer Heppenstall, who was sort of writing from the late 30s until the late 70s. And he's largely forgotten now. And when he is talked about, it's usually in relation to when he was sharing a flat with George Orwell, and Orwell very nearly beat him up. Bold accounts, he was not the easiest man to share a flat with. But he experimented very interestingly with sort of first-person narration. That is an interesting link to what you've just been talking about, because his first novel was called The Blaze of Noon. It was about a blind masseuse. It's a very sensual novel, and he got his wife to lead him around their hometown blindfolded, so he could get sort of some idea of not being able to see and something to draw on in the writing. So Cahun sort of fitted into that interest in sort of fairly marginal figures, but of course, was coming from a position of relative financial privilege. I mean, Avou Nos Avenues, Council Confessions, Disavows was originally published at a run of, I think, 500, and I think was sort of, privately financed. And found quite a small audience, and again it sort of ties in with Cahun's sort of wanting to be kind of seen and to express oneself, and also not wanting to be seen, and feeling intensely conflicted about the idea of self-expression through autobiographical writing, and kind of constantly subverting that and attacking it. And I found this very interesting, but as well as sort of a financial imperative to do more journalistic forms of writing which require more conventional aesthetic forms, also I had different sort of socio-political aims for my writing. Like, as an openly trans writer in the late 2000s, early 2010s, I felt that trans representation in the media was very, very poor, and I wanted to maybe create something that was more prominent and felt like more of a sort of place for people to start if they weren't really sure how to get into these issues, as well as sort of trying to change the mainstream media discourse on trans issues. And on that last subject, like, be careful what you wish for, because the discourse has definitely changed, but not necessarily entirely for better. But this meant sort of having this interest in a figure like Claude Cahun, but for a while at least not being able to draw so much on those kinds of influences. And then I found that, after writing my memoir, I was able to get funding to do a PhD and write my book Variations, you mentioned earlier, which is this collection of short stories about trans and non-binary people in the UK from the Victorian period to the present, or the present being 2014, which uses a variety of different forms. It draws on my interest in, like, modernist literature, And again, you know, it's not a surrealist text really, or for the most part it's not. But getting the funding to do that PhD sort of freed me from financial concerns for a few years, and it freed me up to write a piece like Searching Surrealism, which is one of my more like explicitly experimental pieces of writing. But, you know, for me there is this constant sort of tension between the type of writing I like, the type of writing that I feel is sort of socio-politically expedient to do as an intervention into a discourse or a sort of literary culture at any given time, and the type of writing that's closest to my heart. But also you have to consider, you know, Claude Cahun wrote most of this book between 1919 and 1925, and I think a bit more in 1928, and wrote that way because it was like an interesting and inventive way to write in the 1920s, you know, drawing on this sort of like modernist literature of the time and Cahun's own family symbolist inheritance and complicated relationship with the surrealists, I think, who were sort of notoriously like misogynistic and homophobic. So, you know, you wouldn't want to write exactly like Claude Cahun 100 years later, because then you'd be 100 years behind the times, you know. There's a lot of competing pressures on the writing, and I think that's something I found very interesting about Cahun. You can feel the different pressures on the writing. And indeed, Cahun was asked to write something more kind of straightforwardly autobiographical. And, you know, Avou nos Avenus is an incredibly creative act of refusal.
I believe Don't Get Your Hopes Up was their response to the invitation to write a straightforward memoir.
I feel like that's my response to all of my editors.
But there's maybe like a kind of inversion, because they actually, much later in their life, wrote these quite conventional, unpublished memoirs, which are really much more like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong with holding this mic, but yeah, much more just kind of like recounting life events without subverting the form.
Yeah, I mean, maybe by that point, Cahun felt that, you know, living through what they lived through in Jersey in particular, that they had some life experiences that, you know, it suited them sort of aesthetically or politically, or kind of been creating a historical record, suited them more to document in a more kind of directly and accessibly autobiographical, sort of straightforward way. Mm-hmm. I mean, sadly we won't know, because, as you say, they weren't published, and I think they've mostly been lost. Do these texts
exist? I think they exist in messy fragments.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So you could end up almost as if Cahun is just sort of destined to publish texts in this kind of cut-up, fragmented kind of way, and in this case it's not Cahun's creative decision, but, you know, a decision that the world has taken for them somehow. But yeah, I mean, I think Cahun's experiences in Jersey and the sort of resistance activities that you've talked about, you know, would make an incredible text in whatever form they were delivered. I mean, you know, I don't know how familiar people are with the occupation of Jersey. It's not something that is talked about a great deal. I mean, you know, Jersey is not a huge population. I think maybe was it 500 people at the time, or was it more than that?
It was more than that.
Okay.
It's small.
But anyway, you know, the British government after the occupation basically issued a directive to not resist, which Cahun and Marcel Moore, you know, quite rightly ignored. There's a really interesting film, actually, a feature film called It Happened Here from 1964, which caused a lot of controversy in the UK when it was first released, because it's about a Nazi takeover of Britain. And it really, you know, kind of undercut the myth that we like to tell ourselves, that Britain is just like inherently resistant to fascism, and that, you know, we stood alone, rather than just having the good fortune of being surrounded by water, which is what stopped Britain and its Nazi sympathising poor family from going fascist. But it was based on Jersey, based quite closely on the experience of the occupation of Jersey. So, you know, what Cahun and Moore did there was, you know, incredibly courageous, and would like make a great feature film in itself, I think.
Mm-hmm. I've seen that film, It Happened Here, and I remember this one scene which is like the most English thing I've ever seen, which is two friends are reunited after being separated, and she says to her friend, they've killed everyone, all the others are dead, I'm the only one who survived. And the friend is just like, no expression, and makes a cup of tea.
There's a great quote from Ralph Miliband, who was a Marxist academic and scholar, and someone who said that there was no point working through the English Labour Party because it had been too captured by the security services, and then proved it by having one of his terrible children lead it for 5 years to no effect. But he said that, if Britain were occupied by a fascist force, people would still go to the football, they'd still bet on the Grand National, or they'd still go to church. He basically just says life would just carry on as normal. And yeah, I suspect in a few years we'll get to see whether he was right or not.
How are people doing?
Sorry, I feel with that last answer sort of deviated from the topic a little bit. But,
Shall we? Are there any questions or comments?
I have a question here. That was so cool. Both of your talks, both of your papers were so cool. I'm curious about if there were friends of Cahun's and Moore's who were doing these activities with them, or if they were like on Jersey, or if they were, it was just solo, is what I've sort of always imagined. Yeah,
they were pretty reclusive at this point. I think they didn't really connect with the locals, is my impression, and it was really not safe to. I mean, they had like domestic workers, or like one who didn't know. So they would like keep it in one room of the house and hide it from their maid or whatever. And I think that the story is always that there was no resistance movement on Jersey, and I'm not sure if that's entirely true. I think there were like tiny groups, but they didn't connect with them. It was really like a two-person operation. Yeah.
Yeah, and even in this sort of quite dangerous and public act of resistance, there's still this sort of sense of these sort of private games to it. There's still a kind of playfulness to it that runs through Cahun's earlier work, and even when they're doing this incredibly high risk thing, which is kind of incredible, really.
Yeah, so they're
And
still
probably,
laughing.
Yeah, and probably one reason why it annoyed the occupying forces so much was, they really hated being laughed at.
Right.
Hi. I have a question, but maybe I just complete on that. There was a few resistance on Jersey by local people, mainly to encourage the other people to keep on listening to the radio when it was forbidden, which was a main resistance locally, and some people trying to escape also from the island. But besides that, there was not so much resistance. It was super fascinating to listen to you. Thank you so much. My question is regarding the gender matter of Claude Cahun, because looking at her writings in the late 40s and beginning of 50s, when she wrote about herself and about Suzanne or Marcel Moore, she used the feminine forms. And I was wondering, how do you see the evolution of that matter between the 20s, when she wrote everything and explored all the facets, and at the end of her life?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of just the pronouns that we use to discuss Cahun, like, I find myself oscillating between she and they. And, in my piece I quote a couple of times this line about how neuter is the only gender that always suits me, which is found in Avunos Avenue. I think it's an interesting question. I think it's quite an open question. The concept of transsexual did exist in Cahun's lifetime. Cahun lives until 1954, and that's, a good kind of, more than 40 years into the sort of sexological evolution of concepts around gender identity. Like, the first book that separates gender identity and sexuality is The Transvestites by Magnus Hirschfeld, which was published in 1910. I don't know if Cahun was aware of this line of work or not, but it's not unthinkable that they would have been. But it doesn't really come into the writings in the same way that sexology comes into the writings of, like Radcliffe Hall, for example, the British writer of The Well of Loneliness, where the central character is an invert. So it's this concept that sort of merges gender identity and sexuality. Like, you don't really you know, I mean, Cahun obviously in Vous Nous Avenue is quite resistant to any sort of like labelling of the self, and where Cahun does sort of label herself or themselves, you know, undercuts it pretty quickly. So I kind of get the feeling that if Cahun had engaged more with, you know, these sort of concepts around gender identity, even in their kind of nascent form, you know, it would have been a much more sort of playful sort of writing, maybe kind of against it, rather than someone like Radcliffe Hall who kind of writes into it. That's my feeling. I don't know, Amelia, like, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, so the question's about like the difference between like pre-war and post-war and stuff around gender, basically.
Yeah, how do you think she has done that topic? Saying effectively neutralizing the gender concerned with, and at the end of her life talking about herself as a feminine form and talking about Suzanne as herself as women. I mean, that's what I
there's still plenty of trans consciousness stuff to be traced in the later writings, for sure, including like really explicit statements about my absolute lack of femininity, and Claude is my real name and not a pseudonym. This is like really late in life. And then, I don't know, I mean, living under Nazi occupation, you can't really read the gender presentation as anything but coercive, you know.
I think it's also interesting, obviously Cahun was writing like mostly in French, which is a very gendered language, but with, you know, masculine and feminine options and nothing else. If, you know, Cahun had been writing in German, which has this like neuter has sort of masculine, feminine and neuter kind of, God, my grammar is failing me, but prepositions, I guess. You know, would that have maybe influenced their thinking about the language slightly differently? I don't know, it's you know, just a thing to kind of speculate on, really. But yeah, I mean, you know, sort of Cahun, as far as, you know, I can tell, like used, feminine pronouns, you know, throughout life. And, you know, I don't think there's any of the kind of experimentation with pronouns that you see with like trans writers later on in the sort of 80s and 90s and beyond.
There is some though.
Oh, is that? Okay.
Yeah. I'm writing a longer piece about, gender and stuff. I guess I've tried to avoid doing it directly because, I don't know, I feel like there's always the concern that to impose on the past like a trans or a non-binary identity is like anachronistic or an imposition or something, but the concern is never that we're imposing like a cis identity. Like there's never a similar concern that we would do that. But it's actually like remarkably explicit often, the trans stuff in the writing and including pronoun play. But it's true, it's mostly in the pre-war work. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what living under an occupation does to these questions when you're trying to survive. And I mean, I read like the way they presented during the occupation as a kind of drag of like British middle-age, middle-class, feminine normalcy. Like actually, this bit I had about the cat's paws having retractable claws, I want to bring into a reading of the Burberry coats they wore, which they liked because they had lots of pockets, so they could keep their political tract in all the pockets. And I'm reading this as like the retractable claws or something, but the cat kind of has like this aspect that I didn't talk about, which is like the cuteness of the cat and the presumed innocence of the cute cat or something. And I feel like they kind of like leaned into the femininity that was available to them as a sort of, a costume they could put on in order to carry out the resistance work, if that makes sense.
The idea of extreme British normal drag is just quite amusing to me. Yeah, it's the most boring drag name ever.
Any other questions from the floor? Are you going to write any more about Claude Cahun?
It depends who asks, I guess. I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I mean, there was a sort of revised edition of Cancer Confessions published recently, and I did another event about it in London late last year. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I mean, in terms of film work, I referenced Sarah Pusill's Magic Mirror, and there's a follow-up film called Confessions to the Mirror, so I feel that there are two very interesting and very good kind of filmic creative responses to Cahun, although, you know, now I'm thinking about it, maybe just like pitch a more mainstream film about Jersey, like if we can have a film with Kate Winslet playing Lee Miller, then, you know, who could we have playing Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore subverting the Nazi occupation of Jersey? It'd make a pretty good film.
Who would you cast?
Oh, don't ask me about actors. Yeah, I've no idea. I don't know if you've got any ideas, but...
No, but I think there might be one in production which doesn't seem like the right one, so I hope somebody does a different one. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, if there are no other questions, maybe we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.